started.
Hi all, thanks so much for joining. My name is Dana Fleitman with the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center, which is a project of Equitas. And today, in honor of Sexual Assault Awareness Month, we'll be focusing on the intersection of stalking and sexual violence, understanding the connection. So thanks so much for spending this time and being on yet another webinar. I know we all have a bit of Zoom fatigue at this point. And I also appreciate folks introducing themselves in the chat. It's really wonderful to see that we have multidisciplinary professionals. I'm seeing district attorneys, I'm seeing victim advocates, batterer intervention program staff, corrections probation, so campuses really across the board. So we know it takes a multidisciplinary response for these kinds of crimes. So I really appreciate you all taking the time to focus a little bit more on stalking today. So if you've been on a previous webinar, you know I always start by reminding folks that there are 4 major crimes under the Violence Against Women Act. It's domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. But it's always kind of and stalking. Like we almost called our website andstalking.org because so often it's an afterthought in our field. And especially when we're thinking about sexual violence, both in terms of our general awareness and our general population, as well as our response services, it's simply much further along than our stalking response. You know, we just don't hear as much conversation about stalking, and we don't have a lot of standalone stalking resources. And so it's really up to often our sexual assault service providers to be responding to stalking victims. And so it's important for us to recognize these intersections and that there's so many parallels between these crimes. So a lot of the great work that you're already doing on sexual violence, you could absolutely apply to stalking victims, but you may not be seeing it that way or identifying these victims as stalking victims because it's so under-resourced and under-trained in our field. So I hope by the end of this, you'll just kind of be moving that and stalking a little bit more to the beginning of the sentence and just recognizing stalking as a co-victimization that deserves its own attention and safety planning, as well as maybe an indicator of other types of violence, including sexual violence. So we are funded by the Office on Violence Against Women. We are the technical assistance provider on stalking. So if you want to hear more webinars, if you want follow-up training or resources or individualized assistance, you can feel free to contact us anytime. This is our website. We went with stalkingawareness.org, not andstalking.org. So there we have practitioner guides, and those are broken out by discipline. So we have for victim services, for law enforcement, for prosecution, for corrections. We have training modules. So if you do any kind of community education or campus public awareness, we have scripted programs that you can pick up and lead with slides and videos and things like that. Victim resources. So we are not a direct service provider, but we do provide resources that you can share with victims. So we have brochures available in English and Spanish on understanding stalking that you can order from us free of charge. We have documentation guides and safety planning guidance and other informational things that could be helpful, other resources, and webinars. So this will be recorded and on our archives. We have others there as well. We're also on social media. We're on, especially on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, we're very active. Our handle on there is at follow us legally if you get our sick sense of humor at Spark. If not, it'll be a long webinar for you. So your call either way, but I do encourage you to connect with us and kind of keep stalking top of the mind year round. We'll also have a newsletter you can sign up for. We don't send it too often, maybe about quarterly, to announce new resources. So I hope that you'll connect with us. So today I'm going to do a quick refresher on stalking. If you were with me last week, I did a much deeper dive on understanding stalking, the contextual nature, and the range of stalking behaviors. I'm just going to do a quick refresh on that. Then we'll talk about the commonalities between stalking and sexual violence, focusing on sexual assault specifically. Then we'll kind of switch gears and focus a little bit more on intimate partner stalking and sexual violence. We'll think about stalking and how different forms of sexual violence can intersect. And then we'll consider some big picture strategies for advising victims. So what is stalking? Well, it's important to recognize that stalking is criminal, traumatic, and dangerous. It is a crime in all 50 states at the federal level, in US territories, and on tribal lands. It might be a misdemeanor or a felony, depending on the jurisdiction and the situation, but it is a crime across the board. It is traumatic for victims and survivors, whether it co-occurs with violence or not. And so many stalking survivors experience mental health impacts that can be lifelong, especially post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety. Many lose time from work, many relocate, and it is dangerous. 1 in 5 stalkers use weapons to threaten or directly harm their victims. And in the vast majority of intimate partner femicide, so murder of a female partner by a male partner, and 76% of completed and 85% of attempted, there was stalking the year prior to that murder or attempted murder. And yet so often these early signs are missed or dismissed as, oh, it's just texting, it's just following. And we wait for these instances of violence or attempted violence and look back and see this history of stalking behavior, when instead we want to do is recognize stalking early on, identify and intervene then to prevent this trauma, violence, and possibly even death. And stalking is a prevalent crime. More than 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men in the United States experience stalking victimization. So if you're primarily consider yourself, a sexual violence service provider, that's fair enough, but just realize that absolutely you are working with victims, survivors, and possibly offenders, depending what your discipline may be, that are engaging in stalking. And because stalking is underreported, undercharged, underprosecuted, underrecognized, if you're on the supervision side of things, you might be thinking, well, I'm not supervising a stalking offender, I'm supervising someone who committed sexual violence. And it might be both, right? So it's really you as the responder, the person who's working with that offender, need to really keep stalking in your mind and realize, even if no one else has identified it, there are many points at which we can identify stalking behavior and keep those victims safe and keep those offenders accountable. So what is stalking exactly? There's the behavioral and the statutory definition. Every state has a different stalking statute, so happy to talk statute with you anytime, but today I'm going to talk about the behavioral definition briefly, which is stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So it is 2 or more behaviors that make up that pattern of behavior, which is also called a course of conduct. So you might hear me use those terms interchangeably today. It's directed at a specific person. So it's not, for example, a peeping Tom who looks at a group of people in a locker room. That might still be a crime, but stalking's directed at a specific person, and it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So fear is really important to understanding stalking. But fear of what, right? Because some statutes are very narrow and it needs to be fear of bodily harm. Some are much more broad and it's just fear or emotional distress in general. And so it's important to know your statute. Behaviorally, we see it as fear more broadly. But the truth is that every stalking statute includes fear of sexual assault, because even your most narrow stalking statute, that is, fear of direct bodily harm to the victim only, for example. Sexual assault is a fear that many people have. Sexual assault is specified in a lot of stalking statutes, and even where it isn't, it's pretty much always included. And so there's an intersection right there that if stalking is about being afraid, if you're afraid of sexual violence, that really could be stalking if you're afraid because of 2 or more behaviors. And so I think that's an important thing to know, because a lot of times stalking is confused with another crime that it's often confused with, which is harassment. And harassment could be quite serious. I'm not trying to minimize it, but if we look at the definition here, it's something that creates a hostile or offensive work environment. It includes unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and verbal or physical harassment of a sexual nature. And so, of course, it's going to depend on the situation. I'm not saying it's never harassment or it's always stalking, or I'm not saying any of that. But I do think it's important to think about, because if we're at the point where you have fear of sexual violence because of repeated behaviors or more than one behavior, we may not be talking about harassment. We may actually be talking about stalking. And that's not just a intellectual differentiation to be interesting. It has some very practical applications because stalking has its own risk profile that we want to know. It's an indicator of other kinds of trauma and violence. So we want to know that so that we're thinking that way in terms of safety planning. And it's a different crime that typically is a higher charge as well. And so if we're going through the criminal justice system, we definitely want to be thinking, is this harassment? Is this stalking? Or is it harassment that's part of a stalking course of conduct, which is also possible. So just something to think about, that fear of sexual violence. We're really talking about stalking. So sexual assault and stalking have quite a bit in common. And I know when I started learning more about stalking, it really helped me to kind of recognize some of these similarities because I was much more familiar with sexual violence and some of the misconceptions and important points there. So one is that, again, it is prevalent. We have, and the rates are somewhat similar. Around 1 in 6 women experience stalking. Around 1 in 5 women experience sexual assault in the United States. And of course, we know that both these crimes are underreported. It depends what study you look at, et cetera, but we need to realize that we absolutely have many victims experiencing one or both of these crimes. Both of them can be deeply traumatic with serious and lifelong mental health impacts on victims and survivors. Of course, there's many measures of how that can be measured, I guess to use the same word again. But if we look just at something like lost time from work, we have 13% of sexual assault victims losing time, over 12% of stalking victims losing time. And typically these are not protected classes of worker. And often they're experiencing similar victimizations in the workplace. Either they feel unsafe or in danger from someone who is being sexually aggressive, or it could be that they are, they're dealing with the case, they're dealing with physical injury, et cetera, and they cannot be at work because of this interference in their life. And so we know that both crimes are traumatic in a variety of ways. We also have this myth of the stranger offender. So when I look for pictures of stalking, which I do because I'm fun, okay, this is the kind of stuff I get. And so you see there's a lot of these alleyways and hoodies and strangers and kind of lurking, creepy people. And it puts me very much in mind of the myth of the stranger rapist, right? You have this idea of going down the alley late at night and there's going to be a random person who attacks. And that can happen. I'm not trying to dismiss that experience, but it's relatively rare, right? The vast majority of the time for both sexual violence and stalking, the victim knows the offender knows the victim. And yet people have this myth and idea of who's really scary is this sort of hooded stranger lurking in the alleyway, right? And so it leads to this minimization and this lack of identification from victims because they'll say, oh, that's not stalker. That's just my ex having a hard time getting over things. Just like folks will say, well, that wasn't rape. That was just like this guy I know, right? That same kind of dissonance and misunderstanding can lead to a lack of identification of these crimes. Again, most often perpetrated by someone the victim knows. That's true in 84% of stalking cases and 80% of sexual assaults. And so that myth is a problem and the realities are really quite similar. We also see a lot of minimization and victim blaming in both of these crimes. And so questions like, did you lead them on? If I, saying things like, if I were you, I'd be flattered by what happened. Or it was probably just a big misunderstanding. That's not how they tell the story. Are you sure? They probably just like you. They're just really into you. That's why they acted that way. Or I know that person, they never do that. Those are all questions or statements that you will often hear as victim blaming in response to reports of sexual assault as well as stalking, the sense that it was the victim's behavior, that the offender was just confused about consent or about the victim's boundaries, right? That led to this big misunderstanding. And of course, that's not the case. In the vast majority, we have offenders who are intentionally trying to scare their victims, and that's why they are engaging in the stalking behavior. But this kind of victim blaming is a real shield for offenders who sometimes get away with it under this guise of, oh, they were just misguided, right? And it happens for sexual assault as well. They're both underreported to law enforcement. So fewer than 40% of stalking cases are reported to law enforcement, and fewer than 25% of sexual assault cases are reported. And it's for many of the same reasons. Some of it might be that fear of escalation, right? That victims fear if they involve law enforcement, or if you're on a campus, going through the campus adjudication process, basically bringing in an authority figure or serving that protective order, et cetera, can absolutely escalate the risk to the victim. And so that can happen when charged with sexual assault or for that protective order for stalking. We also know there's a lot of just minimization, shame, and embarrassment from victims, right? This sense that I can't prove what happened. I don't think I'll be taken seriously. It's not worth it. It's not worth the trouble. Law enforcement won't believe me. All of those same reasons that often lead to a lack of reporting in sexual violence can also lead to that lack of reporting around stalking. And so those are a few of the similarities, and please feel free to share in the chat any others, but I think it's helpful because the truth is we do know a lot more. I think generally our field's more familiar with sexual violence, so recognizing, okay, a lot of these same concepts apply here can be helpful. So stalking behaviors can be quite varied, and that context is really critical in stalking cases. A lot of times what's scariest to a victim may seem benign or even nice to an outsider, because those behaviors often have specific meanings only understood between the victim and the offender. So for example, maybe there's an offender who, it's an ex-partner, would always send roses the day after a sexual assault. And then the victim begins receiving roses from that person again. Okay, that can be really scary because it's basically a reminder of that sexual violence, can be really threatening, intimidating, as well as letting that victim know that this person's found them, they know where they are, they know how to get to them. But if all you see is the artifact of like these roses, everyone around the victim's going to say, oh, that's so lovely. They don't understand why it's scary or having that emotional reaction, right? So that context is really, really important, and it's not always apparent. They're different, and we need to ask victims. So if it's not apparent, we need to ask victims about what's going on, right? What about that was scary to you? What message did that send to you? What's the backstory behind this? Because usually if they're afraid, there's a good reason. There are so many different stalking behaviors, and I find this framework really helpful for just broadening our thinking on stalking. It's developed by this wonderful researcher, T.K. Logan, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through these different behaviors. I did that on last week's webinar, but just to remind folks that stalking is not just surveillance. A lot of times when folks think stalking, we get that imaging with like the camera or the binoculars, that really surveillance focused, and that is a part of a lot of stalking cases, but it's not the only thing. And just about all of these different categories can take on a sexually violent edge or meaning here. So surveillance is pretty much what it sounds like. How is the offender tracking, watching, monitoring that victim? And so in a sexual manner, of course, that could be placing a hidden camera to capture the victim, undressing without their consent for something or something like that. It could be that voyeurism, watching the victim. It could be also just keeping track of where the victim is so that they can commit the sexual assault, right? Well, I know when they're alone, I know when their partner leaves the house because I've been watching the house, so now I have access to that victim. So we definitely see surveillance for those reasons. Life invasion is how is the offender showing up in the victim's life where the victim does not want the offender to be there. So the victim's trying to get through their day, and there's the stalker or signs of the stalker. So we see that repeated most often through that repeated contact, right? And so that can often take on a sexual tinge to it, right? That just contacting constantly, making sexual threats, using sexual language. You know, the victim opens up their work email, there's 100 emails from the stalker, some of which include sexual language and threats. Interference, which is similar, but it's what is the victim losing or afraid of losing as a result of the stalker's behavior. So we often see that in impersonation and spreading rumors. And so, you know, to make a profile on, say, a dating website, typically all you need is a photo of the person and a new email address. And so we're increasingly seeing cases where an offender impersonates the victim, spreads rumors about what they like sexually, And that interferes in that victim's life and their reputation and third parties sometimes approaching them, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Of course, the interference from physical violence and sexual assault as well, if that's part of the stalking course of conduct, the trauma and the physical harm that causes absolutely interferes in somebody's life. And then intimidation, that those threats, and the threat's not always of sexual violence, but sometimes it is, or sometimes that's implied or explicit, or there's symbolic violence that implies sexual violence. And so all of these categories can overlap and intersect. It's just to kind of expand our thinking, because I do not mean this as a compliment to stalkers, but they are very creative criminals. And so many are engaging in a variety of these different behaviors. It's not just surveillance, it's not just life invasion. And a lot of these can overlap and intersect and build in really terrible ways to directly threaten victims. So this is a short clip that I think highlights that really well from a recent case. So we're just going to give that a quick watch.
Matthew Herrick says for months he couldn't go to the restaurant where he waited tables or his home without men he didn't know approaching him for sex or drugs. Attorneys Carrie Goldberg and Tor Eklund are representing the Manhattan resident in a lawsuit against Grindr, the gay dating app.
This was a life or death matter. They would follow him into the bathroom at work. They wouldn't take no for an answer.
Herrick says his ex created impersonating profiles of him and arranged sex dates with more than 1,400 men. The actor didn't want to speak publicly today.
But I don't have any comment right now.
So a quick example here, but I think it really shows how these categories can overlap, right? Because this offender is engaging in surveillance, so he's watching the victim. He knows where the victim is, he knows what the victim's wearing, and then he's impersonating the victim. And so he's messaging third parties saying, hey, I'm in this coffee shop, here's what I'm wearing, come find me for what we talked about. Then this victim's being approached by strangers who are intending sexual violence. And so you could see where that intersection there of that surveillance, that interference, now it's really invasive. And now, of course, it's threatening because someone's right there. So all of these can really overlap in a very scary way. Because there are a lot of stalking behaviors, there's also a lot of charges that can be relevant to stalking. So if you can't charge stalking, we'd say charge something, because you're building that history. So if on day one you have voyeurism, and then next week you have non-consensual distribution of intimate images, also known as revenge porn. We don't like to call it that because it's not really about revenge, it's not really porn, but those non-consensual images. So, okay, let's say you over 2 weeks, you have both of those. I understand I'm not your judge, but according to me, Judge Dana, you have a stalking charge, right? You have 2 or more behaviors that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. If you didn't document, charge that voyeurism on day one, now we don't have a stalking case because that next thing looks like the first thing. And so there's a variety of different behaviors that can be charged in this way. And I'm happy to go through a state statute to look at them. But big picture for this national audience, think about some of those other sexual crimes. They're not all sexual physical violence. There might be other crimes that are part of that stalking course of conduct that can help build that history. And so on the victim services end, you want to document that, collect evidence whenever possible. On the criminal justice end, let's keep track of those and keep building that case, combining those sexual offenses with ones that may not be, right? Because you're helping that person down the line when the next thing happens. So now we're going to focus more on intimate partner violence specifically, intimate partner violence and the intersection of stalking and sexual violence. And so about half the time, stalkers are current or former intimate partners. So that's not every stalking case, but it's a significant piece of it, right? About half the time. And so that's what we're talking about here, that intimate partner stalking that makes up about half of stalking cases. And so a lot of times when I hear folks talk about stalking in our field, I'll hear about it the following way, where they'll say something like, okay, it was an abusive relationship, the victim left, and then the offender began stalking that victim. And that can happen, absolutely. But let's take a step back. If during the relationship, the offender was following the victim, asking friends and family where they were, put a tracker in the car, sharing intimate images, taking pictures without their consent, showing up at work, showing up at school, that's stalking, right? It's stalking, and it's what we might call emotional abuse or digital abuse. It's both. It can happen before, during, and or after a relationship. About half the time, it's happening during the relationship as well. And we want to know when stalking is happening during and or after an abusive relationship, and not just call it other types of abuse, because it's its own risk factor. It's also an indicator of other types of violence, especially sexual violence. And so women who are stalked by partners experience a variety of harms at higher rates with women who are not stalked by their partners, and sexual abuse specifically. So in other words, if a woman's experiencing abuse and stalking, they're more likely to be experiencing sexual abuse as well. This is another study that reinforced this. So all these women were abused. All of them had protective orders. Some of them have been abused and stalked. So you can see for abuse only, we're still seeing high rates of all of these sexually violent behaviors, right? Almost half experiencing sexual degradation and coercion, over a third experiencing verbal pressure. So it's certainly the rates are significant for abuse, right? But now let's add stalking. So now we have women with protective orders experiencing abuse and stalking. And wow, look how high those rates go up, where now we go from 45% experiencing sexual degradation, now we've got 61%. Sexual coercion is over 3/4. Verbal pressure almost doubles. Substance use during sex, forced substance use or pressured substance use, goes up to almost 1 in 5. Implicit threats and force, almost half. And penetration while victim sleeping also jumps. So across the board, when they're stalking, these other sexual harms are experienced at higher rates. And then lastly, it also asked if women had experienced rape. So unsurprisingly, for women who experienced all three of these, abuse, stalking, and rape, they experienced very high rates of all these other kinds of sexual violence as well. Almost, all of them experiencing degradation, coercion, pressure, the substance use, all of these jump quite a bit, as you can see here on the chart. And so what does this mean, or why does it matter? Well, what it means is that a lot of women experiencing abuse are also experiencing these other victimizations. And what it means is that if someone's experiencing stalking and these, they're probably experiencing other kinds of sexual violence. And so we want to ask our sexual assault victims about stalking behavior, just like we want to ask our stalking victims about sexual assault behavior, right? Because stalking, again, it's its own risk, it's its own risk profile, and often it's left out. And we know that if our abuse victims are experiencing stalking, they're probably experiencing other harms as well. And so we want to make sure that we're identifying all those victimizations. Women who were stalked by a violent partner after obtaining a protective order were almost 10 times more likely to experience sexual assault than women with protective orders who were not stalked. So it's not just these other victimizations that are not all necessarily sexual assault directly, it's also sexual assault itself, over 9 times more likely. And so again, we want to know when this is going on. Another study found that about 1 in 3 women stalked by an intimate partner were also sexually assaulted by that partner. And so again, really critical to identify these co-victimizations. Intersections of stalking and sexual violence, of course, it's not just sexual assault that is the problem, and there are a variety of different ways that these can intersect. One might be the stalker threatens or plans to sexually assault the victim. So their language, their interfering, their communications might have a sexual component or tinge, or make sexual threats. They might be planning to sexually assault the victim, so they're monitoring them to see when they're available to be assaulted. They might try to get someone else to sexually assault the victim, like in that Grindr example. They might actually assault the victim. That might be part of their stalking course of conduct. Or sometimes the stalking actually begins with sexual assault, and then it's the contact after for that intimidation that then becomes stalking. So we're going to look at a couple examples here around stalking in order to commit sexual violence. So it's a couple cases that I think highlight that really well. So we're just going to give these news clips a quick watch.
A 72-year-old man cuffed and jailed for allegedly stalking a 12-year-old girl at her bus stop in Pinellas County. Arrest records say Abdullah Drajoni followed the girl from her Largo bus stop for over a month, then touched her inappropriately. The next day, police had a lookout while the child got off her bus, and when Drajoni followed her again, they arrested him. He now faces molestation and aggravated stalking charges.
All right, so pretty straightforward here, right? We have an offender watching somebody and then approaching and committing sexual violence. And so luckily here, we're taking it seriously at the stalking stage, but this happens over and over again where someone is watching that victim in order to commit sexual violence. Here's another case that illustrated this really well. This attempted kidnapping that very well may have had a sexual component, at least intended.
News at this hour and new details on that attempted kidnapping at a Catoosa Walmart. Suspect Travis Wilson remains in the Rogers County Jail without bond after being arraigned on charges this morning.
Channel 8's Amy Jensen met with police today who are digging deeper into Wilson's history with the woman. Amy?
Neely, this truly is a scary situation. Police told me that Travis Wilson admitted to stalking this woman every day for 2 months. He said that he knew her schedule down to the minute, but fortunately this woman did all of the right things to help put him behind bars. For 2 months, a scared woman hid in her friend's basement. Police say she was afraid of this man, Travis Reed Wilson.
He'd been stalking and harassing her for several months. It's a jealousy issue.
Officer Brent Colbert told me Wilson confessed to attempting to kidnap his ex-girlfriend from this Walmart Thursday night.
We believed, that he was going to take her back to his residence in Tulsa. To do what, we're not for sure, but it wasn't good.
Officers say Wilson broke into the woman's car and waited for her to come out of the store. With him, he had makeshift handcuffs, gasoline, rope, and tape. To add to the terror, this isn't the first time he's had a run-in with police. And officers don't think this was the first time he's attempted to hurt this woman. This protective order filed just 4 days ago recounts some of the terror this woman has gone through over the last several months, including allegations that Wilson cut a hole in her roof and hid in her attic. And Tulsa police tell me they are investigating at least 2 other cases that involve him.
They're trying to get it done as quickly as possible so that they can get this individual picked up. It's just not an immediate.
All right, so here, and I'm just using this as a teaching tool, this is just one news clip capturing one moment in time. So we don't know the whole history before or after this clip, right? But I think that it is a really good illustration of that stalking to commit a crime, that this offender knew her schedule down to the minute. He knew when she'd go shopping, he knew where she'd park, he knew how long she'd take. And luckily in this case, there was a bystander who saw the offender get in the vehicle and called police, and they got there on time, or else things could have been much worse. But this also is always a reminder to me when I look at this case of the lack of urgency around stalking behaviors until there's this attempted violence. Because, in this case, this woman's been hiding in her friend's basement for 2 months. And only now are we seeing this it's a news story and this officer saying, hey, we're trying to get him picked up, but it's not an immediate thing. We're working on it. So what was going on in those 2 months where she's hiding in her friend's basement? I guarantee you it was some of those stalking behaviors like sending text messages, showing up, sending unwanted gifts, those things that are often sort of dismissed as, oh, that's just annoying. There's nothing dangerous happening here. And I'm not saying that every stalking case escalates to the point of sexual violence. That's not true. But I will say that every week I read cases of violence or attempted violence, like in this case, and you look backwards and see this whole history of stalking perpetration. And we don't want to do that, right? We want to identify that stalking early on and intervene then to prevent this trauma, violence, and possibly even death, right? We want to be able to do that and take it seriously and treat it with urgency early on, because we don't want to wait until there's sexual violence or attempted sexual violence before we're paying attention. Also, if we think about sexual violence and grooming in terms of stalking behavior. So, there's a lot of types of sexual offenders. So I'm not saying this describes every type of sexual offender, but there are those serial sexual offenders who absolutely have a specific MO, right? And they're engaging in the same pattern in order to groom victims for sexual violence. And they tend to have multiple victims, right? And so this is kind of conceptual, but just thinking big picture, those offenders are going to research and identify vulnerable victims. So that might be a child predator, looking online for a child from a marginalized community or who seems neglected. It might be an upperclassman on campus looking for freshman women who don't seem to have a lot of drinking or partying experience. Then they're going to establish a relationship and build trust through multiple contacts. So that could be, oh, I understand you so much better than your parents do, messaging them online. It could be that upperclassman saying you seem really mature for a freshman, whatever it might be. If they haven't yet, they're then going to meet in person and isolate the victim. That might be, come to my house, we'll take some pictures. It might be, hey, I'm having this party, you got to come to it. And then flying that victim with alcohol and separating them to a room where that's often set up for that sexual assault, coercing them into a sexual act or multiple acts, and then typically contacting after, either to say thanks for a great time, or you better not tell anyone, or some conflation of the two, right? And so if you think about this under the lens of stalking, is it a pattern of behavior? Yes. It's more than one contact, right? Is it directed at a specific person? Yeah, they're choosing their victims based on their perceived vulnerability. And would it cause a reasonable person to feel fear? Absolutely. Fear of sexual violence, like I said, is covered under every stalking statute, and that's a fear that many people have. Now you may be thinking, but when though? Because on day one, that college freshman, for example, might say, well, I wasn't scared when an upperclassman approached me. I was flattered, right? That was great. But there's no statute that says when fear has to attach. And so if that, for example, college freshman says, yeah, now that I look back and realize our entire relationship was a setup for my, attempted or completed sexual assault, and it all started with that time they waited for me outside of class, and that's terrifying, we could still be looking at stalking here. And so we want to be thinking about stalking as its own victimization, as well as the one that might lead to sexual violence, and recognize that grooming and stalking often are going hand in hand and really part of the same thing. Soliciting third parties to commit sexual assault, already mentioned that with that Grindr example. Here's another pretty concrete example, a pretty well-known case. This was a former Marine, and he solicited his ex-girlfriend's rape and assault on Craigslist. So if you're familiar with Craigslist, you know that you don't really need to verify your identity, really. And so basically all he did was pretended to be the ex-girlfriend, that impersonation that we see more and more in stalking cases. And so pretending to be the ex, he went on Craigslist and posted multiple ads saying, I have this violent rape fantasy. I want a real aggressive man to come and rape me. And if I yell and scream, that's all part of it. And here's where I live and here's what I look like. And unfortunately, because our world's a terrible place, someone did respond to that ad and violently raped this woman. The only good news is that both offenders were held accountable. And so when we look at a case like this, a lot of folks don't think, oh, a stalking case, right? But it really is. It's these multiple ads, these multiple contacts and behaviors that led to this sexual violence from a third party. And again, I wish I could tell you this is this really off the wall extreme case, but again, through dating websites, et cetera, we're seeing more and more of this impersonation and kind of identity theft leading to sexual violence from a third party. And so that's part of stalking quite often as well. Like I mentioned earlier, there can also be stalking after a sexual assault. So there's a sexual assault and then that contact after, often to intimidate the victim into not reporting, into not believing what happened really was sexual assault. They might send third parties to do so. So when we're thinking about contact, think broadly about contact, right? That could be in person, that offender shows up and says, you better not tell anyone. But we also see that third person. So for example, let's say using the campus example, maybe this was a rape that took place through like at a fraternity party, for example. So maybe now that offender is sending their fraternity brothers to intimidate the victim or something of that nature. It could be through a variety of different contacts, and it could also be posting to your own website. And so this can also be tough to show because, so like an offender might post on their own, say Facebook, saying, oh, people better not tell about this, or making a threat to that victim. And then we get into this kind of, well, is it directed at the victim if they said it on their own platform? And of course, I would argue it is, but you'll have to kind of work that out. But just again, think broadly about contact. It's not just a phone call. It could be a variety of different ways that the offender is contacting and continuing to scare, intimidate, be part of that victim's life, interfere with their life in order to intimidate them. So that could be sitting behind them on the bus. You know, there's so many different ways that contact can take place, and really be looking at stalking victimization. This was a case where the victim was sexually assaulted by a friend, and then the friend impersonated a third party on social media and befriended the victim. And so basically, as this fake person tried to convince the victim that it wasn't really sexual assault. And the victim found out much later that the person they'd been confiding in all along was actually the offender of sexual violence. And they said, finding out the person who sexually assaulted me was the one receiving my texts made my road to recovery even longer. So kind of building that trust and support, trying to find that support network after sexual violence, and then actually it was the stalker, someone stalking all along, trying to convince them, I don't think that sounds like sexual assault, I don't think you should report that, no one really does anything about it anyways. And so just another intersection here to consider. There's also intimate image solicitation and exploitation, again, often called revenge porn. We don't like to call it that, but really that non-consensual images. So the images might have at one time been taken consensually, but they're not being shared consensually. They might have been taken as part of a abusive relationship in which the victim didn't have a lot of choice. They could have been taken, they could be completely faked, right? And we see that a lot, that just photoshopping a victim's head on, you know, a pornographic video, and kind of regardless of how the media came to be, the harm when these are shared online or in social networks can be just really just perpetual and infinite, because once something is on the internet, it's so hard to get it off. And victims often feel like they never know who's seen this. They feel re-victimized constantly. And so we see some stalking tactics in order to do this. So for example, in this case, this offender pretended to be a minor league baseball player, and he went on a dating website, including Tinder, and just asked young women, he was flirtatious, and asked for their phone numbers. And so once that he got their phone numbers, he began threatening them with violence if they didn't send him sexually degrading selfies. So saying, here's what I want to see of you, you better send this to me. And then if they complied and did send the selfies, then he said, well, we need to meet for sex in person, or I'll release these, right? I'll share these images. And so this escalation through the internet, impersonating a third party, and kind of that sharing of images is often part of a stalking case as well. And that repeated contact and that repeated threat. But I'd also like to point out that when we look at fear and stalking, again, like I said earlier, fear of what? So fear of sexual violence is pretty much always going to be covered. For a broader statute, I mean, and behaviorally, I would say fear of your images being shared without your consent, that's a fear, right? And so a lot of statutes would cover that as well. And certainly behaviorally, we would consider that stalking as well. If it's not, they said, I don't think they'll hurt me, but I'm afraid that they'll share this image, this message, etc. That could really still be a stalking case. Speaking of those just doctored images and the sort of harm that they can do, this is a case in which an offender did just that with multiple victims. So I think it's a helpful news clip to illustrate. So we're going to give that a quick watch.
To those young women. Eric Baldwin faces some tough federal charges, including stalking. Agents have detailed how he took photos of college athletes and then photoshopped their heads on naked bodies. Then he'd send those fake nude photos to their parents, their teammates, even places where the athletes worked.
They take it very seriously.
The allegations strong enough, this former federal prosecutor says, to catch the attention of the FBI. Now Denver 7 has learned just how far this stalking went. We reviewed actual emails he's accused of sending. In one, Baldwin claimed he was dying from cancer and told a soccer player, "You are a very beautiful woman and I'd like the chance to spend time with you." Nothing sexual, he said, just a one-time date. Other emails got violent. I'm looking for a woman or group of women willing to beat me up. I will pay you for your time. In another email, he said he'd been watching a student since her first day on campus. Then he threatened, "You and I are going to spend this weekend alone together. To be clear, I'm not asking you, I'm telling you, one way or another, we are going to be alone." Then he described how he would rape the young woman.
You really kind of can't defend on the basis of, well, I really didn't mean it. I was never really going to hurt anybody.
All right, so here, just another strong example of this non-consensual image distribution, which is a crime in most states on its own, but also part of that stalking course of conduct quite often. And again, the fear of that. And of course, a lot of the victim blaming that goes along with that. Oh, why did you take those pictures, etc. Well, there's many reasons why they might have taken those pictures that, we don't need to put a value judgment on. And in cases like this, the photos are entirely fictional, but the harm is about the same, right? And so this kind of leverage and fear and threat is often part of a stalking case. So there are some resources for non-consensual image distribution. The Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, they have their own hotline for this, for people experiencing this, to try to get these taken offline, to think through their options. So definitely recommend that as a resource. So throughout this presentation, I keep saying, hey, that's stalking, or have you thought about grooming as stalking? This is stalking, that's stalking. And, you might be thinking, okay, I get that you're coming from like the Stalking Prevention Awareness Resource Center. You care that we call it stalking. Why do I care? I'm doing great work with victims and survivors of sexual violence. Like, does it matter if I call it stalking? And I will unsurprisingly argue, yes, it does matter, for these and more reasons. One of those charging and prosecution options, I've already mentioned that, charging those smaller, not to put a value on them, but those other sexual crimes like voyeurism, for example, that are often part of a stalking case, you want to charge all of those to build up that course of conduct. Also, most prosecutors like having a menu of options to choose from. So if you're looking at, say, that sexual assault after repeated contact, and the evidence is coming down to this moment of consent or non-consent, maybe consider a stalking charge. I'm not saying this will always work, but if you have a lot of clear evidence of that continued contact, okay, maybe we could actually be looking at stalking and kind of broaden that and still have accountability for something. Also, it's a really strategic charge, and I'll tell you why. Because if you're charging, say, an incident of sexual assault or battery, it's going to be hard to bring in that time in trial, to mention that time 6 months ago that the offender sent a bunch of creepy pictures, because it's likely they'll argue, oh, that's prejudicial, that has nothing to do with this alleged sexual violence last month. But if you're charging stalking, you can bring in that entire course of conduct and paint a much fuller picture of just how terrible that offender is. So those creepy details like the roses and all of that kind of stuff, that can come in here now, more likely anyways. Of course, it's going to depend on your case and your judge. And so it can be really strategic for painting a fuller picture of just how terrible this offender is, that not only do they commit sexual violence, but look at all this other creepy stuff they did, right? That could be part of that stalking charge. Also, safety planning. Stalking is its own victimization that has its own risk. When someone's experiencing stalking, especially when it's intimate partner related, though not only, right? All stalkers can be dangerous, absolutely. We know they're at a higher risk for sexual violence, physical violence, and a variety of other harms. So if we just call stalking emotional abuse or digital abuse, or kind of put it under those other types, we miss the opportunity to point that out and say, hey, this is a red flag. This is an indicator. This might be an especially violent case. And that, of course, we want to take all of our intimate partner violence cases seriously, but this might be one where there's a particular risk of sexual violence as well as other forms of victimization. And we want to be safety planning around the stalking specifically, right? We want to be thinking surveillance, life invasion, interference, intimidation. Let's think broadly. Let's think about stalking behaviors and safety in a comprehensive way that we might miss if we don't label that victimization as stalking. And victim empowerment. Even if a victim says, I don't want to do any of these things, like I'm not going through the criminal justice system, I don't want to change anything in my life to do the safety planning, even just to be able to name instead of, oh, this guy was, messed up to me and he's bothering me, or this person touched me and then they keep messaging me and it's creeping me out. to be able to say, I'm experiencing stalking, and that's a real thing, and other people experience that, and just being able to name that and get information about it, that can go a long way for victims. So for all those and more reasons, I think it is really critical that we name stalking throughout. So a few big picture strategies for responding to victims, particularly victims of stalking, and then I'll open it up to questions. So we need to realize that victims cope with stalking in different ways, and all of these are valid responses, and you've probably done one or all of these at some point in your life and responding to a difficult person or situation. And so some victims move against the stalker. So you're spreading rumors about me, I'm going to spread rumors about you. You're showing up at my house, well, now I'm showing up at your house, right? And that kind of tit for tat, moving against the stalker. You have others who kind of do the opposite. They move inward, become very isolated, don't want to trouble anyone, don't want to put any friends or family at risk. And so they often just kind of withdraw. You have others move away. And so that includes relocating, which 1 in 7 stalking victims move to get away from those offenders. And so we do see that relocating quite a bit. But moving away also includes behaviors like, blocking the phone number, changing your number, getting off Facebook, those kind of different distancing measures. Others do the opposite. They move towards the offender in order to kind of appease them. So, okay, you want to talk every day, I'm going to call you once a week, and to kind of see if they can take the temperature of the situation and keep that offender satisfied with more of a compromise. And then victims might move outward, move to folks like you, victim services, law enforcement, to receive these resources. And of course, that's great. That's what we want victims to do. By the time they're moving outward, they probably tried some of these other things. And so it's good to ask victims what they've done so you can meet them where they are and not, replicate if they've already learned from something they've tried or not tried. But also to recognize that while these are all valid ways to cope, I'm not placing a moral value judgment on any of them. Some may be more or less effective for actually dealing with a stalker. And so what I want to highlight is this moving away. And I hear this advice given to stalking victims quite frequently, and it's well-intentioned, but not always very helpful. So you'll hear, okay, if they keep calling you, change your phone number. They're following you, change your routes to and from where you're going. They're contacting you on social media, get off that platform. But let's play that out for a second. So just a few quick facts about stalking. The average duration, not the high end, the average duration of a stalking case is 2 years. 10% of cases last 5 years or more. The recidivism rate's extremely high, and stalkers are generally very persistent. So all that being said, if I'm stalking you, and then one day I just keep calling you, let's say I call you on the phone all the time, eventually you're like, I'm so over Dana stalking me, I'm going to change my number. So one day I get that message that's, oh, this number is no longer in service. Am I the stalker going to be like, oh man, I guess I'll stop stalking you and become a productive member of society this day? No, what am I going to do? I'm definitely finding your new number, and actually I might escalate my behavior because I'm angry now. My favorite way to stalk you is on the phone. So now I know your email, I know where you live, I'm going to show up and actually be more dangerous. And so multiple studies have shown this. When a victim tries to distance themselves, the offender might escalate their behavior. Now, I'm not saying that victims should take no steps to move away from the offender. I'm just saying it's not this obvious low-hanging fruit that will solve the problem that it's sometimes presented as. There's pros and cons there, right? And so you want to ask a victim how they think the offender will react. Do you think that that'll really communicate to them that I don't want to see them and I think they'll get the message and stop? Great. Or that'll just make them angry and they'll escalate. From a criminal justice perspective, we want to know what the victim's done to distance themselves because it shows that resistance and persistence, right? Change my email, found new email, change my number, called on new number. That's showing a lot of persistence. So from a charging perspective, that can be really compelling evidence. From a victim safety perspective, did that help? Maybe, maybe not. We also see sometimes this moving towards the offender, and this might seem counterintuitive. And so a lot of times, a protective order is thrown out if they find out the victim reached out to the offender. On campuses, no contact orders are mutual. And I think the logic there is that, okay, if the victim's really afraid, they're not going to reach out to that person. That, proves they're not really afraid. But let's think about that for a second. So if And to back up for a minute, we do generally, one piece of that moving away advice that's helpful is we do often want to advise disengagement. And that's because stalkers do see every contact as a win. So if they call 100 times and the victim picks up and says, I hate you, don't call me, tomorrow they're calling 101 times because that was a win. But that being said, that disengagement is not always possible or realistic. So you want to do both, advise no contact and realize victims move towards the offender in that engage in behaviors to keep themselves safe. So for example, there was a case where the victim called the offender at 2 a.m. They talked for 3 hours. And so the defense is saying, look, how scared can she be? She's obviously not scared. If she was scared, why would she call him? So we asked the victim, and the victim was like, yeah, I called him because I got off work. I knew he got off work at the bar. So I could hear him get in his car, drive home and fall asleep. I knew he wouldn't come over, break my windows and wake my kids up again. Very practical, right? So sometimes it's about that, keep your enemies closer, trying to appease the offender, moving towards the offender. That can minimize the threat and be in the best interest of their safety. So you want to do both, advise disengagement and realize victims engage in behaviors to keep themselves safe. If there are hard and fast rules in your jurisdiction about that, make sure the victim knows, but also make sure that you have an open dialogue with that victim about their contact with the offender, right? So it's not like a secret or something they did that was wrong that you found out about later. And I love this image at the bottom here with these social media notifications, because this is what a lot of victims are dealing with for days, months, years on end. So you can imagine how tempting it is to respond and say, hey, knock it off. And for that to then prove that the victim's not really afraid seems kind of ridiculous to me, So again, you can't change the whole system necessarily, but just think through that with the victim in the context there of why that contact happened. It doesn't mean that there wasn't stalking or there wasn't sexual violence or there's not fear. Of course, with victims, you want to center safety, absolutely. Advocate and realize that advocacy might involve a lot of education on stalking, because a lot of folks just aren't super well informed on stalking. And so making that case that stalking is serious, it is criminal, there's something we can do about it, and it often intersects with these other types of violence. Documentation, so we want to document everything that happens, and support services. And those can be quite varied depending on the stalking victim. That might be housing, financial, mental health, variety of different things that a victim might need. In terms of documentation, we often tell victims to document, but we don't always tell them how. And so they end up saying, it was a sunny day in Washington, D.C., when we're like, oh, we don't want to use this. And so something very succinct like this can be helpful. We have it on our website in English and Spanish, just date, time, what happened, where did it happen? There are a lot of jurisdictional issues in stalking cases, and most victims don't understand jurisdiction. And so if they got a sexual threat while they were, at home in the suburbs, and then they went out to dinner in the city and the person approached them and slashed their tire, and then they went to a friend's house, and that's where the offender actually approached them and attempted sexual assault, for example. Those are all stalking behaviors, but they might be in 3 different jurisdictions. And so if the victim called the police, they usually don't realize that police are not coordinating across those lines, right? And so victims often feel like every time they're calling, it's the first time and no one's putting the pieces together. And truthfully, within the same department, there might be a different responding officer every time. And so if a victim calls with something that sounds relatively minor, like I got this kind of creepy text or picture that was a little sexual in nature, the officer may not respond with the urgency, realizing that, well, this is the 10th thing today that's happened, right? And so the truth is these behaviors add up, but they only add up if we do the math. And so something like this can really help with that, to help connect those dots. And it's unfair. It's unfair that victims have to do all this work, but it's necessary at this point in order to best show the full extent of what's going on. And you want to encourage victims to save the evidence. Now, understandably, if a victim receives an upsetting text message, they want to delete it, right? But you want to encourage them, actually, let's save that, let's document that to help build this case and to also safety plan more fully about what's going on. Of course, what we need in these cases is a lot easier said than done, which is coordination. And the truth is that our system is not set up for stalking and sexual violence cases. It's really not. It's set up to be incident based. So it's much more set up for there was a sexual assault, we're responding to that one sexually violent incident. It's not set up for this bigger picture of the intersection in which we have often multiple contacts, many of which are highly contextual in nature, sometimes over years, sometimes over jurisdictions, and really putting those pieces together. And every week, again, I read cases of violence, often sexual violence, preceded by a whole lot of stalking, but it wasn't taken seriously until that attempted or completed violence. And usually it's not because one person made a mistake. It's not like, oh yes, that one officer should have made this one call and then we would have been good to go here. It's usually really a systems issue because we need people in all of our positions really working on this together, right? We need our awareness educators to make sure the general public is aware of stalking and the intersections here. They recognize that it's a crime in its own right, traumatic in its own right, as well as often intersects with sexual violence. Then when a victim talks to, let's say, a friend or family member who we know they're going to talk to before they go to that victim service provider, most likely, that friend says, hey, that sounds serious, let's get you some help. We need our victim service providers to identify stalking, safety plan around it distinctly, and identify that, this might mean there are other co-victimizations, let's explore that. We need our law enforcement to charge stalking as well as sexual violence. We need our prosecutors to pick up that charge and argue it effectively. We need our courts to sentence appropriately. We need our probation, parole, and corrections folks to continue to hold those offenders accountable and keep those victims safe. Again, recognizing that they might be supervising a stalking offender without that offender being called a stalking offender. But when you recognize all the stalking behaviors, you realize that's what's going on. It can cause ongoing harm to the victim. When any of that doesn't happen, we lose victims. And I see that again and again, and we don't want that happening in our country, in your community, anywhere, right? And so there's no one whose job it is to recognize the intersection of stalking and sexual violence and then act with urgency, and coordinate the system. It's no one's job. So it kind of has to be all of our job. It kind of has to be you who, if you recognize this intersection of stalking and sexual violence, who says, hey, this is urgent, this is serious, and let me do everything I can to help this victim navigate the system, which is imperfect, right? And to help keep them safe and hold that offender accountable. So a few resources to help do so. Equitas, the prosecutor's resource for violence against women, sparks a project of Equitas. So they have great resources on admitting digital evidence, on charging non-consensual image distribution, and we often co-train with them on stalking and prosecution of stalking. So definitely a wonderful resource for prosecutors and court personnel, free, available 24/7. There's no national stalking hotline. The closest thing we have is Victim Connect, run out of the National Center for Victims of Crime. And they're typically going to refer to victims to rape crisis or to domestic violence crisis. And that might be confusing to the victim because if the victim is primarily concerned about stalking and it's from someone who maybe, was not an intimate partner, they might be like, well, why are you connecting me to rape crisis when I got this suggestive text from an old housemate or whatever, right? And so you need to explain that even if the offender is not related to intimate partner violence, typically those intimate partner violence responders who are able to address the stalking as well as sexual violence. And so if you're ever sharing the RAIN hotline, the DV hotline, make sure you share Victim Connect as well for stalking victims. And of course, everyone's favorite website, stalkingawareness.org. You know it, you love it. Practitioner guides, again, broken out by discipline, for victim services, for corrections, for prosecutors, training modules for those awareness educators, victim resources like the documentation log. There's also a risk assessment specific for stalking. We have links to that through our website and webinars like this one. You can also connect with us on social media, and I hope that you'll do so to kind of keep stalking in your mind year-round, especially on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We're also on LinkedIn and YouTube. And sign up for our newsletter, which again, we as folks who think about stalking, we don't like to contact people without their consent. So you have to sign up to get on our list. We won't sign you up automatically. So please do sign up. We don't contact too often. And this is my contact information. Thank you so much for your attention to this issue and for joining yet another webinar during COVID times. I know everything I said is easier said than done. It's one thing for me to sit here and say, do this, consider this. What about this intersection? You're the ones who are actually on the ground, keeping victims safe and holding offenders accountable. Everything is easier said than done, and I totally understand that. So truly, thank you for the work you do. I so admire and appreciate it. And feel free to reach out anytime for further resources, etc. And I hope that you have an excellent rest of your day and an excellent rest of your Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and consider those intersections with stalking. We have a infographic as well with some of those intersections on our website to share. So I hope that you'll do that. I see a couple folks asking about the certificate. Yes, if you email me, I can get you a certificate of attendance for today's presentation. And this was recorded and will be posted on our archives sometime in the next couple weeks, just depending on timing. So with that being said, I will conclude here and just open it up if there are any questions. So again, thanks so much. And yeah, if any questions came in, let me know, Al.
There was only one question that I saw in the chat, and it was referring to one of your slide. It was slide 29, and it said women who were stalked by a violent partner after obtaining a protective order were 9.3 times more likely to experience sexual assault than women with protective orders who were not stalked. And the question was, is that 9.3 times more likely after obtaining the restraining order or in general?
That's a great question. I'd have to revisit the study to remember with absolute certainty. I think, let me just see if I can remember when I'm looking at this. In terms of when the sexual assault took place is the question.
What it said was, are they more likely after obtaining the restraining order or in general? So yes, when the sexual assault.
Yeah, okay, so I need to look back at the study to confirm that. So it's a good question. I'll look that up and I'm happy to email you with that. I can't remember if it was an indicator that they're more likely to have also experienced sexual assault, or it means they were in increased risk for sexual assault after. So it's a good differentiation. So yeah, I will look it up. I don't want to lie to you, so I will double check that.
Okay, perfect. And then that's the only question that I saw in the chat. If there are any more. And just people asking about the slides, if they're going to be available, which you already went over.
Yes, we'll definitely send a PDF of the slides, and we're available for future trainings. We do mostly organization specific trainings. We only do these ones that we kind of offer to whoever around quarterly. So definitely feel free to reach out for more information and for training.
Okay, perfect. And those are all the questions I saw.
All right, sounds good. All right, well, thanks so much to you all and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.